So after World War one of the first regions that really begins to push for self-determination and self-rule was India. And India kind of gets a head start on other colonies, partially because they had been settled earlier, and so they were kind of further along in this process of self-determination. And we also saw a large class of Western educated Indian peoples that begins to lead this push for self-determination. They start to spread ideas of democracy and freedom. And so the Indian National Congress, it was actually created before World War One. They were dedicated to pushing for Indian independence. And before World War One, they basically created these councils made up of Indians that advised the British overseers and made suggestions and tried to avoid conflict between the British and the Indian peoples. The Muslim League was also created before World War One because they feared an independent India would be dominated by the Hindu population. And so they pushed for Muslim rights, and specifically, they wanted a separate Muslim state created out of India. We also had an early leader in B.G. Tulak. B.G. Tulak supported nationalism in India and also supported a strong Hinduism nationalism. He wanted a return to kind of the classical Hindu culture and philosophy. He was against women's education and generally against women's rights, but called for things like a boycott of British goods and demanded full independence for India. As he progressed, he also became more violent and supported the use of violence if it was needed in order to gain independence. And so as he starts to spread this message of violence, Britain ultimately has him arrested and he's exiled for 6 years in Burma, and that kind of weakened his cause. Well, then we have the rise of Mohandas Gandhi. Mohandas Gandhi becomes a leader of Indian nationalism. And he was another one of these Western educated elites who studied in London and brought these ideas back to India with him. However, before actually helping India win independence, he actually helped South Africa. He spent 25 years in South Africa helping fight discrimination against Indian peoples in South Africa. And it's there that he begins to embrace this idea of passive resistance and learned that those techniques could work, and then he brought those ideas to India. So he develops his principles of passive resistance, or what he called the satyagraha, which meant truth and firmness. And so he believed in nonviolence and tolerance in order to end British domination of India, and becomes a political and spiritual leader. He was known as the Mahatma, the Great Soul, and was also very popular amongst the lower classes of India because he was against the caste system. And so he's going to help lead this push for Indian independence. He leads the non-cooperation movement and the civil disobedience movement. He leads a great salt march where groups of protesters marched to the sea to collect their own salt so that they could avoid purchasing these imports from Britain. He supported homespun Indian textiles instead of the imported British textiles. And so he's going to be one of the key leaders during the interwar period that ultimately helps lead to India's independence shortly after World War II. In the Middle East, after World War I, Egypt was basically still a British protectorate. And Britain kind of maintained an army presence there in order to keep order and protect their interests, especially in the Suez Canal. Well, gradually, resistance to British rule continues to grow. And a lot of that resistance was led by the Effendi, which was kind of a new class of professionals that was developing in Egypt. And also journalists played a big role, using the newspapers to spread resistance to British influence in Egypt. Also, just before World War I, the Din Shuai incident took place. So the Din Shuai incident was a group of British soldiers were hunting pigeons in a Egyptian village, Dinshwa. And while hunting these pigeons, they accidentally shoot the wife of a prayer leader there in the village. And this leads to a massive protest, and these angry protesters kind of surround these small number of British soldiers. Violence breaks out. Several villagers and a British soldier die in the ensuing violence. And in retaliation, Britain comes in and they hang four of the villagers and order many other villagers to hard labor. And so this is going to lead to even more uprisings and protests against British rule in Egypt. And then after World War II, as these protests continued, after World War I, these protests continued to spread. And many of these protests were led by, again, these newly Western educated students who used ideas from Europe to push for their own independence. And a lot of these were put down violently by the British. And it's within this kind of protest that we see the growth of the WAFT Party. The WAFT Party is going to help organize this resistance against British rule. And gradually, Britain is going to grant Egypt independence. It took place from 1922 to 1936. Gradually, Britain withdrew out of Egypt, but they did keep their presence in the Suez Canal because they had to protect their interest in the canal. Another territory that actually gained independence, one of the few territories that gained independence after World War I, was Turkey. And so in Turkey, they had been part of the old Ottoman Empire. And as the Ottoman Empire was divided and carved up, Mustafa Kemal, better known as Ataturk, is going to lead a widespread push for self-rule and actually gets it. Holds off European powers to establish self-rule in Turkey. And they're one of the few regions that actually get self-determination after World War I. And once taking power, Ataturk is going to modernize Turkey. He brings in industrialization, he brings in Western ideas, creates a more secularized law code. Women actually benefited as well, and actually kind of modernizes Turkey. Now, they would continue to struggle, especially with poverty and social issues, but Turkey does ultimately win their independence after World War I. The rest of the Middle East, for the most part, was disappointed after World War I. Again, the Arabs had been promised self-rule, and Britain basically goes back on that promise after World War I and refuses to grant them self-rule. And another growing issue in the Middle East was the creation of a Jewish state. So Zionism is the push for a Jewish homeland because the Jews had no state. They were always kind of an ethnic minority no matter where they were. And so they wanted a Jewish state created in Palestine, in the original Holy Lands of Judaism. And so as more and more Jewish peoples began to migrate to the Eastern Mediterranean and what was Palestine, many of the Arabs resisted these Jewish settlements. And that's going to lead to the outbreak of violence between the Arab Palestinians and these incoming Jewish settlers. And ultimately, that conflict is going to continue and kind of culminate after World War II with the creation of Israel. Another territory region that was unhappy with these peace settlements after World War I was Africa. And during World War I, Africa had provided many soldiers for the European armies. The fighting had spilled over into many parts of Africa as well. And after World War I, Europe continued to exploit Africa for their natural resources and cheap labor. And Africa was economically dependent on Europe. They had to purchase their manufactured goods from Europe because they weren't allowed to develop their own industries or lacked the money and resources to develop their own industries. And most of their raw materials were purchased by Europe. And so much like in the Middle East and India, we see some Western educated elites began to lead a push for African nationalism. And like many parts of the world, Africa was upset at the lack of real reform and lack of self-rule after World War I. And so these new elites, these Western educated African elites, begin to lead this push for freedom. And they begin to help introduce Western ideas of freedom and equality to African nations. And it's going to be these elites that help lead the push for self-rule after World War II.